Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me, hopefully? Excellent. So welcome to the first of our Centre for the Study of Governance and Society seminars of this new academic year. I'm Mark Pennington and I'm the director of the Centre. So before I introduce today's speaker, Shterna Friedman, I'd just like to give a few quick notices about some upcoming events that we've got at the Centre. Next Thursday, the 21st of October, we've got Professor Cass Sunstein, who's going to be giving a Zoom webinar entitled Not Wanting to Know. The start time for that is 12:30 UK time, so I'm not our usual start time because Cass Sunstein works, as some of you may know, for the Biden administration, and he has to be in the office for 9 AM US time. On November 23rd, we are going to be hosting our first in-person event since February 2020, a long, long time ago. It feels almost like a lifetime ago. And then we're going to be having Professor Mike Hume from Cambridge University, who's going to be giving a research workshop entitled Beyond Scientific Rationalism and the Illusion of Climate Governance. So on to today's session. We've recently started a new research project at the Centre entitled The Political Economy of Knowledge and Ignorance. And one of the streams of work in that project is exploring the significance of Michel Foucault's ideas on the concept of power knowledge and how that operates in different systems of governance. So I'm very, very pleased today that we have with us Shterna Friedman, who is something of an expert on certain aspects of Foucault's thought. Shterna is doing a PhD at UC Berkeley in California, and she's going to speak to us today on Foucault and systems of oppression. So as is usually the case in these events, Shterna is going to give her presentation, and I would invite you to put your questions in the chat boxes or the Q&A box, and we'll curate those at the end of the session for Shterna to answer. But at this point in time, I'd like to welcome Shterna to give her presentation. So welcome, Shterna.
Thank you. I should make an addendum or amendment to your introduction, which is I'm not an expert on Foucault, as you said, on some aspects. Actually, my current project is on Kant and Hegel, but it's on Kant and Hegel's view of systemic theorizing. I'm trying to understand the origins and problems of thinking about society as a system. And there are two ways of thinking about society as a system: as a cause of social ills, and as a name designating the effects of individuals' interactions. So the end game of this project is to arrive at Foucault's way of thinking about systemic theorizing, but we'll get there. So let me just say that it may seem strange to think of Foucault as a contributor to this tradition of thinking about systemic theorizing, because if there's anything most people know about Foucault, it's that he was a vicious critic of systemic theorizing, a vicious critic of, well, vicious. He was a critic of totalizing thinking and treating it as totalitarian. And there is a lot of truth to this conventional view of Foucault, but my talk could just as easily have been entitled Foucault Against Himself, because I'm going to present two types of Foucault. The Foucault who is what I'm going to call the explicit Foucault, Foucault as he appears at the level of his programmatic statements. And then there's the implicit Foucault. And this is the Foucault who emerges when we examine how he actually goes about arguing and when he actually goes about doing history, especially as it's presented in his most influential work, that is influential in the United States, which is Discipline and Punish. Now, the implicit Foucault is the one who paints the picture that anyone who reads Discipline and Punish is likely to get immediately, This is the picture of an all-pervasive system of oppression that insidiously exercises power not only behind our backs, but inside our heads, through our bodies, constituting us as individuals. Against this picture of an all-pervasive, insidious system of oppression, Foucault explicitly rejected systemic theories such as Hegelianism and Marxism, precisely because they're totalizing. The term to which Foucault is referring is Hegel's word for the ultimate all-encompassing system, which is totality. When Foucault programmatically criticizes Hegelianism and Marxism as totalizing, what he means is that they treat a dominant unitary principle or structure, such as Hegel's idea or capitalism for Marx, as producing a unitary system that leaves no room for contingency, multiplicity, or importantly for Foucault, disobedience and resistance. This critique of totalization, however, is in tension with a picture that Foucault paints in Discipline and Punish. My focus will be on Discipline and Punish because my impression is that for Americans at least, that's the work by Foucault that has most influenced the way we think. And it did so precisely by painting this implicit picture of power as a totalizing system, which flies in the face of his programmatic opposition to totalizing theories such as Hegelianism and Marxism. I'm going to suggest that this tension between the explicit Foucault, who is against systemic theorizing, and the implicit Foucault, who paints a picture of society as an oppressive system, is the result of his tacit reliance on functionalist explanation. I'll talk about functionalism soon enough in the third part of this talk, but first I want to discuss the explicit Foucault and then transition to talking about the implicit Foucault. So let me take a few moments to flesh out the explicit Foucault. Foucault denied that power emanates from a single unitary locus, such as the state or the economy. Instead, power relations are multiple and diverse, stemming from many different sources. And there are many different types of powers that go beyond merely the power to prohibit and to violently punish. By the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, according to Discipline and Punish, an older state-centered model of the exercise of power began to be replaced with a new model of power that is still with us. This is what Foucault calls disciplinary power. In this new model of power, power becomes largely invisible. Power is now manifest not in the person who wields it, but in the effects it exerts on all of us. We each become calculable, describable objects of power, and we are slowly constituted into obedient, docile subjects who participate in the very act of subjecting ourselves to power by normalizing ourselves. Yet we are often not aware of the fact that we are constituted by power. And this is not just because power has become invisible to us, part of our everyday norms, but also because it takes on different forms, different chameleon-like forms. It takes a form of justice or equality or freedom. And crucially, power takes the form of knowledge or truth. It becomes bureaucratized, scientificized, technical, and it hides behind expertise. So this is what Foucault calls the power-knowledge complex. It governs us, it manages us, and it calculates our behavior, often with our consent, because we respect claims to truth. In the case of punishment, instead of a sovereign, a unitary sovereign who inflicts violence on the bodies of his subjects, now prosecutors and defendants alike bring in criminologists, psychologists, and other experts to use their knowledge to help characterize not just the nature of the criminal act itself, but the nature of the criminal. They use their knowledge as a form of power that establishes norms that separate the normal from the abnormal. This use of various disciplines of knowledge to exert power is one of the aspects of what Foucault means when he talks about disciplinary power. it stems from the disciplines and what he means by the power-knowledge complex. Knowledge is one of the important ways in which modern power exercises itself. Now we're going to start transitioning, and you may already see that we're transitioning to talk about the implicit Foucault, transitioning from the explicit Foucault. The explicit Foucault, who challenges the idea that power emanates from a single locus, such as the state or the economy, is, by virtue of that challenge, nevertheless giving us an implicit picture of power as a sort of sovereign miasma that envelops and constitutes us at every turn by virtue of its invisibility. It's hard to conceptualize this picture that Foucault is painting without using phrases like the one I've just used, such as that modern power exercises itself, as if it is itself a sovereign subject, even though Foucault denies that that is what it is. One way to understand this tension in Foucault is in terms of cause and effect. Now, recall the distinction I made right at the beginning between two ways of thinking about a system, as a cause and as an effect. In the case of Foucault, on the one hand, in this new regime of invisible, unseen, and insidious power relations, the effects of power are implicitly totalizing. They utterly form and socialize us. It's impossible to be outside of power. On the other hand, the sources of power are explicitly not totalizing. Instead of emanating from a single center, they are dispersed, multiple, overlapping, and sometimes contradictory. Since there are multiple overlapping sources of power, and since each individual is the site of diverse local power struggles in the family, in the workplace, in political life, and economic life, no single source of power is decisive in shaping us. And there is explicitly room for resistance of some sort, resistance to power by alternative sources of power. While Foucault glancingly mentions this explicit anti-totalization view of power in Discipline and Punish, he doesn't focus on it, at least not in the way he does in interviews that he gave before, during, and after the period he wrote Discipline and Punish. And these programmatic statements about the possibility of resistance come through most explicitly in the first volume of History of Sexuality, especially part 4. So at the explicit level, Foucault rejects the notion that society forms a single system of power, understood as a single cause that acts upon us. We are the effect of this cause. However, implicitly, there is the fact that the different sources of power, schools, hospitals, courts, prisons, etc., they all share similar techniques. They all tend to rely on forms of scientific knowledge that discipline us insidiously and invisibly. Take, for example, Foucault's treatment of power as understood as the panopticon. This is the famous prison designed by Bentham, in which an anonymous guard in the central tower can see at one glance all the cells, all the prisoners in their cells arranged in a circle. This power observes, but it also internalizes itself in the prisoners, who have to regulate themselves so that if they are being observed at any given moment, they will be seen to be obeying the rules. The prisoners make themselves the enforcers of the rules, and they do this most effectively if they internalize the rules as their own norms. Now, similarly, consider the power technique of the examination. This is the regular testing we go through in schools or when we go to see a doctor, in which our traits are measured, collected, and compared with a given population declared to be normal or out of range, and on the basis of which we are held back or allowed to advance. Once again, at least with school examinations, the most effective way of passing is for us to internalize norms, such as listen to the teacher or study hard. Both of these powers, the panopticon and the examination, work through science. We are made objects of scientific examination, and we are then compelled to form ourselves according to the norms of this observation. So despite the heterogeneity of sources of power techniques, they all nevertheless converge to create similar effects, to homogenize us, to shape heaps of living matter into conforming individuals. This would suggest that the sense conveyed in discipline and punish, that we are living in a system of power in which society acts as a totality upon us, is a product of the unitary effect of power rather than of its unitary source. The picture painted in Discipline and Punish is a picture of society with many different techniques of power that nevertheless function in tandem as if they were designed to work together as a single system. For example, Foucault contends, and I quote, "Prison continues on those who are entrusted to it, a work begun elsewhere, which the whole of society pursues on each individual through innumerable mechanisms of discipline." And I end the quote there. This is a classic statement of the implicit Foucault, and I should emphasize that by implicit Foucault, this implicit Foucault is just as explicit in the text as the explicit Foucault, but it's the Foucault who emerges as he is doing history, as opposed to the Foucault in his programmatic statements. So he's basically acting as a historian when he's acting implicitly. So the question is, what kind of argumentation is he using? Now, Foucault is well aware of the picture he paints in Discipline and Punish. Early in the book, he talks about the political technology of the body. This is the individual body, not the social body. And he warns us that this technology is diffuse, it's rarely formulated in continuous systematic discourse, and in spite of the coherence of its results, it is generally no more than a multiform instrumentation. So you can see here the distinction between the singularity of effects and the multiplicity of cause or sources of power. And this is important for Foucault to make this distinction between the multiplicity of the sources of power and distinguish that from its systematic effects, because if he presented power as coherent, not just in its effects, but also in its cause, then he would not be able to as effectively describe the way in which we are inextricably embedded in power, the way in which it is impossible to overthrow it by finding and seizing its center, as Lenin did, or thought he did. Part of Foucault's critique of Marxism is that it led to Stalinism. Stalinism is not just some peripheral aspect of Marxism, it's a central growth of Marxism, because it assumed that power is less insidious than Foucault thought, and thus more concentrated in its centers, the state and the economy, and thus it could be seized at its center. So now, with this picture of the explicit and beginning pictures of the implicit Foucault, let me go on to talk about functionalism and how that works in Foucault's argument, mode of argumentation. So far, it might seem that Foucault's account of power is a sort of emergent system, where system names the effect of decentralized forces rather than the cause of systematic effects. If so, then if we compare Foucault to, say, Hayek, it would seem that the difference is a difference of normative valence. Hayek depicted the spontaneous order or emergent system of modern society as legitimate, while Marx clearly thought, Foucault clearly thought it is illegitimate. That's a little hint of where I might be heading at the end. But Foucault's account is not a story of unintended consequences, as Hayek says. If we ask why so many strategies of power in so many different domains nevertheless seem so similar in masking power in knowledge, and why they all produce similar effects, Foucault's answer is ambivalent, as always. But another powerful aspect of his implicit story is the suggestion that the similar effects of power stem from similar and quasi-deliberative sources. I'll explain what that means. And here's the ambivalence. On the one hand, Foucault rejects the view that the change from centralized power to disciplinary power was the product of new ideas held by specific individuals, such as the humanitarian ideas expressed by such penal reformers as Beccaria, Servan, Lacartelle, Pastoret, and Bergasse, and others whom Foucault lists in Discipline and Punish. And he suggests that even when their reforms were accepted, the history of prison reform went in a very different direction, from the ground up rather than from top down. That is, instead of from new ideas to new mechanisms, the direction of reform was from new mechanisms. I don't know about whether to new ideas, but new ideas is a separate story. This suggests, in this account, this suggests a story of unintended consequences. On the other hand, Foucault often tends to use the language of intentionality when he's trying to explain either the emergence or the persistence of specific modern power structures. Now, consider this passage from Discipline and Punish, in which he tries to explain why prison reform has failed again and again. So here I'm going to quote directly. Is not the supposed failure part of the functioning of the prison? Is it not to be included among those effects of power that discipline and the auxiliary technology of imprisonment have induced in the apparatus of justice and in society in general, and which may be grouped together under the name of carceral system? One should ask oneself, what is served by the failure of the prison? One would be forced to suppose that the prison, and no doubt punishment in general, is not intended to eliminate offenses, but rather to distinguish them, to distribute them, to use them, to assimilate the transgression of the laws in a general tactics of subjection. That's a very clear, explicit statement of what I've been calling Foucault's implicit argument. As you can see, he is talking about the hidden function of the prison. Now, to see how this type of functionalist analysis works, let me take the case of Foucault's explanation of why modern criminal justice, he calls it modern criminal justice, relies so much on non-juridical elements, particularly scientific experts. I quote, "Today, criminal justice functions and justifies itself only by this perpetual reference to the knowledge of scientific experts in criminology, for example." So modern criminal justice brings in the knowledge power of disciplinary experts in order to lend the proceedings an aura of science, so as to exculpate legal power from its own participation in punishment. Thus, modern power makes itself invisible in order to hide its complicity in power. This seems to be an intentionalist explanation, not an explanation of unintended consequences. But whose intentions? The answer, I think, is implicitly the intentions of a system. Modern criminal justice is being painted as a system, and power knowledge is being painted as functional to the need of that system for legitimacy. Because Foucault, having rejected the idea of a human sovereign with ideas, has no other sources of intentionality and thus functionality other than the system itself. So let me pause here to characterize what exactly I mean by functionalist explanations such as this one. Now, there's a weak form of functionalism, which in our case would be along the lines of this. Expert knowledge serves to legitimate political power. That would be a claim of weak functionalism. This might allow for the legitimating function to be an unintended consequence of a discipline of criminology that grew and persists for independent reasons, such as the fact that a lot of people were trained to think that social science techniques can predict which individuals are likely to commit criminal actions. But then, coincidentally, the legal system found it convenient to use criminologists to lend it some legitimacy. That is, certain judges and certain bureaucrats came up with the idea of promoting this new discipline for purposes of legitimating criminal justice. That's a type of weak functionalism. Then there's a stronger type of functionalism that would say that the very purpose of expert knowledge is to serve this legitimizing function. That is, criminology wouldn't exist if it did not legitimize judicial power. Not in the sense that the ideas of individual actors created and sustained criminology, but in the sense that the legitimation function was itself the cause of criminology. This is the claim that follows from the structure of Foucault's argument about the relationship between criminology and the modern justice system, even though it is not a claim that Foucault makes explicitly. Now, the strong type of functionalist explanation has been criticized. When a cause exists in order to produce its effects, that is a teleological explanation. Analytical Marxists such as Jerry Cohen and Jan Elster and Michael Rosen consider teleological explanations illegitimate because they are non-explanatory, in the sense that they reverse the order of causation. The effect, legitimacy, is treated as an explanation of the cause of criminology, as if the cause caused its own cause. So according to this objection, functional explanations constitute backward reasoning. Now, there's something circular or question-begging about this objection to functionalism, even though it may feel very intuitive. The issue is whether you insist that the only type of causation is efficient causation, like where a billiard ball hits another one and makes it move. In efficient causation, cause always precedes effect. Therefore, by definition, teleological causation is ruled out a priori. Causes are temporally prior to effects, so to treat a cause as existing in order to produce an effect reverses time's arrow, suggesting the presence of the effect even before the cause has come into existence, and which comes into existence just to produce the effect. But if you believe in teleological causation as someone like Hegel did, then this isn't a problem, because in teleological causation, very loosely speaking, the future can cause the past if the future embodies the organism's telos. However, the next question is, if you believe in teleology implicitly, what is the organism that has a telos? That is a telos of oppressive power. When we're talking about criminal justice or prisons or medicine or social science or education. I think the answer has to be a system, because there is no other answer available to Foucault, having rejected efficient causation by individuals and their ideas. To see this, let me step back and mention what I think is a more telling criticism of functionalism from Elster and Rosen, and this is its lack of mechanisms. Generally, there are two types of mechanisms when it comes to human relations: mechanisms that work through and by individuals, and mechanisms that work at the social levels above the individual level. Within the individual, there are also mechanisms that work below the conscious level and at the conscious level, but let's bracket that. Now, Foucault explicitly maintains that power works only by and through individuals. But in explaining, say, the relationship between criminology and modern criminal justice, He doesn't provide individual level mechanisms that would explain how it came to be historically that criminology functions to legitimate modern criminal justice. Recall my alternative of weak functionalist explanations about the independent source of criminology in individuals' ideas about social science and about criminals that arose, these ideas, criminology arose for independent reasons, rather than in order to legitimize modern criminal justice. Foucault has nothing like this, making his explanation a strong functional explanation. Now, the individual, of course, is himself a system of a type by virtue of having a single nervous system. But when it comes to society, it is harder to see it as a system because it is not clear what the analog to a central nervous system might be. So social explanations that imply that society itself is the cause of patterns and regularities will have a harder time providing a mechanism to explain how society produces these patterns. I think this is the box Foucault finds himself in. A weak functionalist might wish to say that individual judges want to hide their complicity with power. But if Foucault were to go this route, he would have to explain why do all judges have the same wish? A weak functionalist might be able to point to the education commonly received by criminologists to explain why they might all tend to have similar ideas and why judges might all have the same ideas. That would be the mechanism. But Foucault can't point to anything similar. There is both an epistemic problem and an ontic problem here. Epistemically, Foucault doesn't have evidence that any particular criminologists were actually motivated to lend legitimacy to the system, rather than being motivated by, say, their ideas about truth or about justice. Now, ontically, what is the mechanism that would explain a pattern of homogeneity in their behavior? In the picture that I think it's fair to say we take away from discipline and punish, we, the readers, supply the missing mechanism, and we supply that mechanism in the system. We say it's the system that imposes this pattern of homogeneity. But explicitly, I think Foucault would deny that he's trying to posit and anthropomorphize a system by saying that it exists, that it's all powerful and has intentions. He would also reject the idea that the legal system is a single unitary system in anything but name, since that would be to totalize it, to treat it as a totality rather than as a multiplicity of power relations. So before I close, let me go into one other implication that arises from Foucault's reliance on strong functionalist explanation. And this is the question of whether Foucault lives up to his explicit claim to be a historian of contingency, not a philosopher of necessity. That is, it's a question about whether he's both a historian and whether he's focused on contingency. Now, in a strong functional explanation, cause and effect are necessarily related. If the relationship were contingent, we'd have a weak functional relationship where it may be accidental or coincidental, that criminological ideas unintentionally lend legitimacy to modern criminal justice. If Foucault had allowed for contingency, then there would have been no suggestion that there is a system that somehow intends for its disparate phenomena to all work together to legitimate the exercise of power. This intentionality, as we've seen, is crucial to the picture Foucault paints, but he explicitly portrays himself as describing contingent relationships that may change. Indeed, his strongest explicit purpose is to reveal the contingency of what we, shaped as we have been by power, have come to regard as natural and therefore as necessary and unchangeable and as ahistorical. Yet, non-Marxist historians describe contingency when they show that idiosyncratic individual motives and decisions sometimes lead to unintended consequences. I think to really be true to his commitment to contingency and to historicity, Foucault would have had to be willing to descend to the level of individuals and all their idiosyncrasy. Contingency is what he explicitly condemns in totalizing theories such as Marxism and Hegelianism for ignoring. But discipline and punish seems to ignore it, at least in the general picture it paints. This turns the variety of techniques into techniques of power in the disciplinary sense, in which such techniques all have the effect of disciplining us to conform. So Foucault writes toward the end of Discipline and Punish, and I quote, "In its function, the power to punish is not essentially different from that of curing or educating. It receives from them the sanction of technique and rationality." By contrast, Foucault allows that in the previous era, the classical age of sovereign or centralized visible power, techniques such as gruesome corporal punishment sometimes did not have the intended effect. Sometimes they cause popular discontent, not obedience. This is just what a conventional historian would show: idiosyncratic, unintended consequences. But when we enter the modern era, the era of disciplinary rather than sovereign power, idiosyncrasy and unintended consequences disappear, contributing to a frightening picture of power that is not only intentional at the systemic level, but inescapable, and in its own way, sovereign and all-powerful, again, at the systemic level. This explains the common left critique of Foucault as a quietist. If power is this powerful of necessity, then there is little point in trying to resist it. Now, let me end by explaining why this disjuncture between the explicit Foucault and the implicit Foucault is not a critique of Foucault. Nothing that I've said actually constitutes a criticism of the implicit Foucault or the explicit Foucault, but this goes back to the sense in which it begs the question to demand that a teleologist conform to contemporary scientific standards by supplying efficient causal explanations. I've been suggesting that Foucault is a teleologist of modern society as a system of oppression, which organizes its affairs in order to discipline its members more effectively than it could hope to punish them. This may be inconsistent with Foucault's explicit self-understanding, but that doesn't constitute a criticism of him. It would be a criticism only if we reject systemic theorizing as inherently illegitimate, but that would be begging the question. So this project is really an attempt to understand Foucault by understanding the implicit, but clearly stated, side of his work as a historical product. I'm asking where Foucault might have acquired a functionalist systemic style of thinking that runs so contrary to contemporary social scientific standards. The fact that this is the same style of thought that agitates analytic Marxists about Marx suggests an answer, as I already gave away a bit with my slip of tongue earlier. Elster, in particular, views his own work as an attempt to expunge Hegelian systemic functionalism from Marx. Without going into details, Hegel provides a very complicated justification for systemic functionalism that was transmitted to Marx, but significantly changed, but was significantly changed by him before being passed down in a variety of crisscrossing forms that I haven't yet fully mastered to French thinkers of the post-war period in France, such as Foucault's mentor Althusser. There is also a separate stream of Hegelian influence on Durkheim, that may also have influenced some of Foucault's other mentors, such as Canguilhem and Bachelard. And I hope that by understanding each of these thinkers' forms of post-Hegelian systemic theorizing, we can eventually grasp how the implicit Foucault, who has been so influential, came to be. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Shterna. That was absolutely fantastic. Really, really fascinating presentation. Just while we wait for maybe some of the people who are attending to formulate their questions, I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, this is something that's been puzzling me about Foucault's ideas, and maybe, you know, sort of my attempt to offer some kind of a solution. So I very much take your point about one of the problems with his theory is there's a lack of a set of mechanisms to explain how these sort of power networks develop without having this kind of systemic view. Now, wouldn't one way of trying to give an account of those mechanisms be to posit some kind of evolutionary mechanism? Now, he himself was against, as I understand it, using evolutionary kind of metaphors, but wouldn't it be possible to give an account of how people who adopt certain kinds of power practices have some kind of competitive advantage over other actors within a certain environment? And then through that, you have a kind of imitation process, which leads to the kind of homogeneity you're talking about, where lots of people are basically using the same kind of techniques, but without anybody ever actually having intended that effect in the initial place. So in the same way that in a market environment, a firm may introduce a new business practice and it turns out to be more profitable, their intention isn't for it to be copied by lots of other firms. But when lots of other firms do that copying, it then creates what looks like a systemic effect, almost as though someone had designed the process. So what I'm saying is, wouldn't some kind of evolutionary notion give an account of how you could have these power relations developing without there actually being some sovereign center of control, and without implying there's some kind of systemic force as such that's operating?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the kind of suggestion you make in your article, where you try to marry Foucault with Hayek. What you just suggested is a very methodologically individualist account of how this homogenization would work. And it would, so sure, if you can provide that, sure, but it would have to be at the level of individuals. It would have to be at the level of their ideas, at least their it doesn't have to be necessarily conscious ideas, perhaps implicit ideas. But you would need to provide a very different empirical panorama than Foucault actually provides. So this is not to say that you can't arrive at an explanation for systemic effects, you know, homogenization. But at the same time, once you start going down to the level of individuals, down to the level of their ideas, and talking about things like imitation, the fact that imitation keeps spawning variants of imitation even suggests that they're also, at the same time, while there may be a tendency towards homogenization, there may also be a tendency towards heterogeneity. And the question is at what, you know, the question you would have to answer the question at the empirical level. When are the homogenizing ideas so powerful that there is little escape, and when is there more escape from such homogenization? But may I ask, do you see Foucault as providing this methodologically individualist account? Like, am I missing something in his account?
I think if you look at the final writings, there's that quite famous essay called The Subject and Power, where he's trying to, people say, recreate a role for the subject. And that's where you get more of the language of resistance. And that is the idea that people working within a given set of practices sort of can challenge them or tweak them. And then you get a sort of ripple effect flowing out from that as other people start to adapt to those changes. So it's quite a dynamic model. It's not a sort of, if we use economic language, it's not a static equilibrium model. He has a kind of disequilibrium view in these later writings. And it's hard to think of how, you know, given that he's emphasizing in those final works that people can resist power, it is an individualist account at that level, I would say.
Yeah, I would say that the later writings, this is why I was focusing more on the mid-70s, where he is closer to the episteme model, the systemic models that he relied on early on. I will say I'm not as familiar with the later volumes of the history of sexuality, but at least when I look at things like his later lectures, there is a tendency still to rely on functionalist language. Now, the question is, to what extent is this merely rhetoric, such that if you pushed him, he would break things down to methodologically individualist stories or narratives? Or is he still implicitly going way back to his early systemic phase, still implicitly relying on those old structures of explanation? Now, I think like in his interviews, that's where he provides his programmatic statements. So that's the explicit Foucault. And even at the time when he's writing, so I've been reading his, let's see if I can find it, his, you know, this Intolerable that just came out about his writings from Michel Foucault in the prison's information group. So he is extremely interested in the power of resistance early in, 1971, 1972, 73, et cetera. And so at the programmatic level, he is always, not always, but even before Discipline and Punish, he's accepting the possibility of resistance. But when he gets down to doing actual history, so at the level of the mode of argumentation rather than what he says, about what he's doing, that's when he falls into these older, or for him, older styles of systemic argumentation. So I'm not saying that you can't make Foucault consistent with some sort of methodologically individualist account. It's just that the picture of Foucault that has been so influential in the United States is often this implicit picture that has affected a lot of accounts of systemic oppression, systemic racism, as if there's a top-down process, even though explicitly he would deny that.
Yeah, well, I understand entirely. I mean, there are so many, he said so many conflicting things. I've been reading quite a lot of it lately myself, and it's, it takes a while to get your head around it. I have to say, I don't think I've entirely succeeded by any means. So I think we've got a question in the chat box. This is from Otto, and the question is as follows. Foucault has been frequently claimed by mutually incoherent groups, such as Marxists, anarchists, and neoliberals. To what extent did his slipperiness in his political commitments derive from his desire to be value-free or even amoral in his analysis? And what, if anything, does a system-centric reading of his thinking tell us about his possible ideological commitments?
I would like to ask Otto what he thinks, because this requires me to speculate about Foucault's motive. I agree that there is a bifurcation in among Foucault scholars about whether we should read Foucault as purely neutral. So that would be the more amoral, slippery reading as just describing the way things are, as opposed to critiquing the way things are. I think if you read what's going on in this collection, Foucault clearly thinks that describing is a political act. It's an act of resistance. And there's definitely people who read Discipline and Punish often tend to come away thinking that Foucault is not just describing disciplinary power, but implicitly condemning it, often falling into the language of coercion, subjugation, et cetera. Now, what does this, so about the question what, if anything, does a system-centric reading of his thinking tell us about his possible ideological commitments? My tendency would be to read Foucault developmentally, and I would say, why did early on, when he was in the episteme phase, so this is the phase of the order of things in the 60s, why was he engaged in thinking about society as a system, and why did this way of thinking, I'm suggesting that he retained this way of thinking even though he explicitly rejected it. I think in both cases, at least explicitly, he was against, we have to, if we contextualize him in the Cold War period and think of him as anti-Stalin, as so many people were, especially after the Gulag Archipelago was published I think in French in 1974 or something, the revelation of the Stalinist terrors made many leftists back then worry about falling into the totalizing phase of Marxism, or think that Marxism was totalizing. And Foucault's way of explaining why Stalin went so wrong is not to say that this is just a strange perversion of Marxism, but that it's central to Marxism, because Marx, well, maybe not Marx, but Marxists did not truly understand power, the nature of power. They thought of it as stemming from a single center, when if you see it as so diffuse, then resistance, or at least revolution, becomes more of a utopian dream. That doesn't mean resistance is impossible, but I mean, I think Otto's question about at the implicit level, so now I was just talking about at the explicit level, but at the implicit level, the question is, to what extent you think Foucault thought emancipation was possible? I mean, he thought it was normatively desirable. So why else would he think that it was so important to explain that power is not opposed to freedom or to agency or to autonomy? And why else did he criticize the notion of a transcendental subject, a phenomenological subject who stands over and above power? He criticized that view of subjectivity because he thought it didn't really allow for true emancipation. At the same time, I'm not quite sure. I mean, in various writings, he seems to go back and forth in thinking that resistance is a real form of emancipation. I mean, I think, especially in the later writings, the writing that Mark was referring to in the 80s, in the Cure of the Self writing, he is heading away from a system-centric reading of power. It becomes very individualized. Each person has to work in themselves and resist on their own level. So Otto, the most I can say is that you've put your finger on something difficult, and slippery is a very good term for it.
Okay, I can't see any more questions at the moment, but if people have got questions, please do put them in the box. One question that, just while we're waiting to see if other people can come up with questions, Shterna, is this on this question of systems.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't you say if you have this sort of think of an alternative view here, that there are sort of multiple interconnecting systems rather than a system? And again, if you're looking at sort of what might look like systemic effects at some larger level, they would arise in the overlap. But that doesn't imply that there is a system as such. And it's still remarkable, isn't it, how today in social science, most people still speak as though there is a system of some kind or other. So people speak about capitalism or liberal democracy or some other isms that are there. They assume that there is a system, as opposed to there being perhaps interconnected systems at a more localized level that may give the appearance of there being some kind of system without actually such a system being in place.
Yeah, can you tell me what you mean by the, I guess I would even wonder what it means to talk about a local system. Is it just, how would you translate that into methodologically individualist terms?
I don't think it has to be methodologically individualist even, but you could think about there being, even when we use the term society, is there a society, or is not society a society of societies? So the units within that could be collective groups. They don't have to be individuals. They could be cultural units. They could be all sorts of things, but there isn't a unity. That's the key point. And you don't have to be a methodological individualist to reject the idea of there being some kind of unity.
Yeah, I mean, that is Foucault's position, at least at the explicit level, that we shouldn't be thinking about society in the singular, but in the plural. And that's Laclau and Mouffe, I think, had a 1984 very, very short article on society is impossible or society doesn't exist. I forget the title. But the idea is that we have to speak about overlapping societies. We have to pluralize systems. We have to speak of multiple centers. And this is the whole French project. So I agree with you that there is this, that on the one hand, there is sometimes a tendency to talk about society, at least in politics, at least in reading the newspapers and talking to friends. It's very easy to fall into the language of singularity when talking about society. But at the same time, there was resistance to this pluralization of society as a system. But I still wonder whether pluralizing society as a system, what are we trying to do when we do that? I think at the end of the day, we're trying to explain heterogeneity on the ground. And if that's what we're trying to explain, why are we using the language of systems at all, even if we're pluralizing them? How does that help? Why not start at the level of individuals, or even below the level of individuals? I mean, in other words, this pluralization of society and of systems already suggests a strong historical tradition that is presuming from the start that the level of explanation is super individual. And this is why I've been going back to Kant and Hegel to understand where this way of thinking about it comes from, because even when you pluralize systems, often you retain many of the components of systemic theorizing. So one of the aspects I pointed to at the end was its necessity and its ahistoricity. So if you're trying to, number one, explain heterogeneity on the ground or the way things actually are, often that involves contingency. I mean, I may be begging the question to say it often involves contingency, but in principle, if we're trying to provide a truly historical explanation, we would have to allow for the possibility of contingency, of accidents, of unintended consequences. And at that level, I don't think even a pluralized systems account can deal with contingency, because a system is an interrelationship of parts that stand together in a fixed relationship. In other words, it's as if one is positing a necessary conceptual or logical relationship between elements, rather than a truly historical and contingent relationships, which means that those parts and those elements may just be incomplete, may not add up to even like modern criminal justice as one system, prison, schools, like even treating those as a system. So that would be my hesitation about pushing back against the idea of a unitary system to the idea of a pluralized system. My question would be, what implicit presuppositions are you still retaining that may be metaphysical, theological presuppositions that stem from Kant and Hegel, even Hegel, for example, the great totalizer, supposedly, is talking about a totality of totalities.
Wouldn't one possibility be that you can recognize the role of supra-individual phenomena, but without claiming that they have this kind of deterministic effect? So, the example I'm thinking of is if you think about human language, and obviously, Foucault is a discourse theorist ultimately, but there are other sort of theories of language which do emphasize that language has a kind of downward causation effect on people. We're born into languages that are not of our making, but and to some extent they actually affect the way we frame the world, the way we understand it. But they don't preclude us from exercising agency at the micro level. So we're both formed by language and we form it at the same time. You've got a sort of, you have no agency without structure, but you have no structure without agency. That type of process, that's the sort of way that I view sort of Foucault, or I try to think about him.
I guess I agree that we're all born into what seems to be structures, in the sense that there are many things that we can't change, at least not all at once. But even in the case of language, it's true precisely what you said, that from the perspective of the person born into a language, we cannot change that, and it feels like a structure, but I don't, or at least I'm thinking about the way I use language. I search for words. I misuse words constantly. So in other words, it does not feel, it feels extremely messy. It does not, and jokes, a lot of jokes are puns, a lot of jokes are using language in new ways. I know you're not saying that you can't change it, but I'm just wondering what extra value are we getting from treating, say, language as something that shapes us in that kind of way that we won't get, let's say, if we step back and go. So this is a deeply phenomenological, subjectivist account where within someone's mind, I go into someone's mind, and my mind in particular now, and ask, how am I experiencing these things that you're calling structures? Because the structure is the observer's term for why the agent makes this choice and not that choice. But from within the agent's perspective, I know your point is that some choices may not even seem available to the agent, and that's what the structure is. So you can call it that, but at the level of trying to explain why people do what they do, is structure that important, at least at that level, along, especially if you accept the presuppositions that come along with structure, as opposed to getting into the agent's head and saying, well, this person was interpreting that situation in this way because of the historical inputs into that person's web of beliefs.
Okay, we've got someone in the chat. This is from Pavel. Could we say that the infrastructures we are born into are jointly produced and reproduced and transformed as we use them while going about our ordinary business of life? That is both intentionality and unintentionality, or that is both intentionally and unintentionally.
So, so Pavel and Mark, tell me if I'm not getting this, but it sounds to me as if Pavel is pushing back on Mark's point, and saying that, yes, there may be structures that we're born into that we produce and reproduce, but that we also transform in some way, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. And I guess my response to Pavel would be similar to my response to Mark, which is what added explanatory value are you getting from talking about infrastructures in this way. Now, generally, when Marx was talking about infrastructures in this way, about the production and reproduction of structures, it was in order to condemn the present and to explain the possibility of a future in which those structures would be utterly transformed. And the more Foucauldian, explicit Foucauldian at the level of the possibility of resistance to Foucault, is there are these structures that we can, at the margin, at the periphery, through these local struggles, we can slowly transform them, not in whole. We can never do that in whole, but always in little bits. So yes, so if you want to call that infrastructure or structure, fine, but that already assumes so much order to the messiness of life, or at least to our experience, to some people's experience of messiness of life, that other than as a form of social critique. So bracketing the question of social critique from the question of social explanation, what is the advantage to that way of thinking other than this more phenomenological subjectivist approach? I think it makes prediction easier. That's again, prospective, but I'm talking about retrospectively. What value does it add?
We've got another question. This one's from Dimitri. So does Foucault's account allow us to distinguish between relations of power and genuine attempts to improve social outcomes in the society? For example, the attempt to measure us, or the attempts to measure us, are they always proceeding from the intention to realize power? Is it all just about power? Or bottom-up actions with purposes other than the realization of power that can take place but look like the exercise of power? So I guess the question is really, is everything just about power, or are there any actions that we can sort of refer to that aren't either attempts to bring about power or the effect of power?
Mm-hmm. Dimitri, I think you have the beginnings of a very nice critique of Foucault. Because the answer, in effect, is that Foucault is a Nietzschean. So what that means is that Nietzsche talked about the will to power. So life itself, just the very force of life, is a force of power. That's so. If you sort of step back and ask yourself, if you didn't know what the term power, pouvoir, that Foucault used, if you didn't know what that term was, but you were trying to find a term to plug in, to capture what he was describing, perhaps life might be a good word, or perhaps Geist, that's Hegel, or some other term. But the idea is that, yes, just as there's no, all of us living beings, moving creatures are full of life, everything, all action are products of power, or all movement. But I think you're asking for bottom-up actions with purposes. So now you're talking not about the explicit Foucault, but the implicit Foucault, with purposes other than realization of power can take place but look like exercise of power. So this is what I mean, that you're turning Foucault against himself. So Foucault is suggesting that everything that seems like not power are exercises of power. And you're reversing that and saying, why should we think that that's the way things are? Why shouldn't things that look like not exercise, that things that look like exercise of power are actually just innocent, let's say innocent incompetence? I think if I had to say where this picture of the implicit Foucault, where this painting of the picture of the implicit Foucault is coming from, is the possibility of allowing for incompetence or contingency. So perhaps there are just ideas. What is the example? Are they always genuine attempts? I think your term is genuine attempts to improve social outcomes. Yeah.
So I guess an example would be, I think maybe Dimitri's referring to public health measures at the moment, for example. Do we just understand those as part of some power knowledge complex, or is there any element of what happens in a situation like that where we can just say this is not an attempt to exercise power over people?
Yeah, precisely. So yeah, Foucault would say that all uses of knowledge or uses of knowledge are, so his question, so the way he reframes Nietzsche's will to power is to talk about the will to knowledge. So anytime we're talking about genuine attempts to improve social outcomes, Dimitri's phrase, we're already phrasing what we're doing in this very neutral, objective sounding language. And Foucault would ask, why is that the way you would like to phrase what you're doing? What is going on beneath the surface that explains why you trust neutrality or objectivity or truth in that way? And his answer is, yes, it's power, but it's not the picture of power that is that people usually talk about when they talk about state power, as you realize. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Just have a look. I don't think you've just got Dimitri saying thank you very much, Shterna, for answering the question. I don't think we've got any more questions on the list actually, so it's getting quite late, and I think we've given you hopefully a reasonable discussion there, Shterna. I apologize for it being a bit of a dialogue at some point, but I hope my questions were reasonably helpful. And I have to say, I thought that was a fantastic presentation. I mean, I think, for people who've grappled with Foucault, he is I think he's a fascinating author, but very difficult to just grapple with all these different possibilities. And I thought you did a really fantastic job there of going through some of those ideas. So thank you very much, Shterna, for that.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's good to see you.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending. And just a final reminder that next Thursday at 12:30 UK time, we've got Cass Sunstein. So hopefully you'll join us for that. Meantime, thanks very much. Wherever you are, whether it's good evening as it is here in the UK, or good afternoon in other parts of the world, or even maybe good morning somewhere else, I don't know. I hope you have a very good day. So thank you very much and goodbye.